36 billion rand. This is how much gender-based violence cost South Africa in 2019. The startling sum was revealed in a report titled "The Costly Impact of Gender-Based Violence." The authors of the report say its aim was to drive accountability within the private sector and influence GBV-related system change and policy making. Let's break down the numbers as well as the research behind it with one of the report's authors, Tiki Barnard, who is CEO of the Shared Value Africa Initiative. Tiki, thank you so much for joining us in studio tonight. So victims of gender-based violence should certainly be the main focus while, advocating for combating of the crime. But these crimes come with that hidden cost to South Africans at large, 36 billion rand. Unpack that number for us.
So what we did with the research, we looked at secondary data that was supplied by the World Health Organization. And what we looked at, firstly, we looked at out-of-pocket costs. So if I'm a gender-based violence victim, I need to maybe go to the doctor, I've got to catch a taxi to get there, and I have to take time off work. So that out-of-pocket cost that we've estimated was 10 billion rand annually in 2019. And that's really, really very, very conservative. I want to say conservative almost 3 times, because that's how, when we looked at that cost. So that's the 10 billion. Then what we looked at the human capital cost. And human capital cost is about mental ability. How does it affect you mentally? How does it affect you physically? How much time do you have to take off work? How does it actually influence your capability of doing your day-to-day chores that you have to do? So the human capital cost, when we looked at what the World Health Organization reported, was 26 billion. So if you put those two together, that's your 36 billion. But inside of that, also added to that, is another 104 million that was, that was about legal cost. And sometimes we know from a legal perspective, the legal, the system also let the victims down, but there is a cost, 104 million. So that makes up the 36, the 36 billion that we spoke about. Yeah.
As part of that human capital cost, does that also factor in the impact on families and communities at large? Because it's not just the victim who often has to take time off work. Sometimes there's couples or family counseling that needs to take place, when a victim goes to court to maybe, see that the case is followed through. She's not going alone. They're going with family members, extended support from community, and that all has a broader impact.
As a broader impact. That's why we say that 36 billion is very conservative. I think if you go back in 2014 when KPMG had that report that they what did they call it, too costly to ignore. They estimated then that it was between 24 and 42 billion. Then in 2015, another McKinsey report about the gender gap, they reported that it was something like, it was costing the global business, it was costing us we can add $12 trillion to the global GDP if we address gender inequality. And then the European Union in 2021, they had their gender report. It's costing them something like 366 billion euros. So my question, and I always want to say, I want to put that question to the private sector, is if the cost is so high, why are we not doing something about it? Because every year we look at the figures. We hear our Minister of Police giving us the figures and everything, yet gender-based violence persists.
So part of this report is holding the private sector to account and asking them to intervene. But why specifically the private sector?
Because if we go back to gender-based violence, we have not, government, NGOs and NPOs have not been able to shift the dial on gender-based violence. So what we then said as an organization, we sat down and we said, okay, who's the missing link here? So the missing link is the private sector, because they've got the resources, they've got the capacity, and they have the power to actually change economies forever if they address gender inequality in the workplace. Because women will be more empowered. We'll be able to leave those relationships because we get equal pay. You know, and there's a lot of reasons why we can reduce gender-based violence if the private sector gets involved.
So a lot of social inequalities to be addressed first, in other words, in order to address gender-based violence in the long term. Looking at the short-term picture, obviously the goal here is also not to monetize the situation or the pain of the victims, because, you know, to someone who's been through a horrific ordeal, you know, what the country at large is losing from gender-based violence is the last thing on their mind. So what is your hope that this report will help achieve in the short term?
For me, from a short-term perspective, for my hope from a short-term perspective is that we will be able to shift male leadership mindsets. That's really whose minds we have to shift. And I don't know if it will happen in the short term.
It's quite ironic that we're once again two women sitting discussing gender-based violence when it should be the absolute prerogative of males to discuss this and formulate a plan.
Absolutely, absolutely. And my thing was, when we released the report at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange on the 11th of August, you know, somebody was saying, because we have Prof. Mervyn King and Bonang Mohale there to speak, and somebody was saying, why all the male voices? I said, because the female voices are not heard. So we have to get these males to now raise their voices in order to try and help us to, you know, to fight for gender equality. And when we say fight for gender equality, which is Sustainable Development Goal number 5, we want equality in the workplace. That's what we want, regardless of gender. It's equality in the workplace. And yes, it does focus on women, but I mean, we need to look at gender equality in the workplace.
With staggering unemployment in South Africa, and a large chunk of those unemployed being the women who are then made additionally vulnerable through their unemployment to gender-based violence, what is one of the ways we can, I mean, the problems are just so huge. They seem so insurmountable. But apart from creating long-term and driving long-term employment drives, I mean, what is there that we can do? How can we help women in these dire situations?
I think what we, you know, that the government started the GBV National Strategic Plan, and I think, you know, we've always been, you know, we're part of that as well. I think there needs to be funding. They're really, really safe houses needs to be really safe because they're not safe. So they have to be safe. I mean, you know, I was just reading earlier on today about, you know, a pastor in a Methodist church, which shall remain nameless, you know, is now in jail because he was raping one of his 15-year-olds. So, you know, I think that in the short term, we need to create safe spaces for our women, because there is no safe spaces for us. Because, you know, walking down the street, when you have to leave work at, you know, late in the afternoon and you've got to walk to a taxi, you don't feel safe. We don't feel safe as women in this country. Yet we have we're such a big contributor to the economy. So make us safe and we'll even be a bigger contributor to the economy.
Absolutely, the numbers speak for themselves. And just to end off there, Tiki, unfortunately we have run out of time here, but the latest crime statistics released, 9,000 plus women raped between April and June this year. Just to sort of maybe jar our viewers, that's 105 women every day. 105 women in South Africa raped every day between April and June. So 36 billion could be added to our GDP, and those 105 women a day could be spared a horrific ordeal if we can just all get together. Thank you so much for your time, Tiki Barnett.
Thank you very much.
Speaking to us, the CEO of Shared Value Africa Initiative and one of the authors of that report, The Costly Impact of GBV. Go and have a look, read up. Let's all expand our minds.